please. We're going to get the session going. Dr. Schama has literally a flight to catch, so we are going to aim for a hard stop at 11:55, and that means that I'll keep my questions to a bare minimum so that as many of you as possible can get in on the conversation. I'm going to dispense with most of the formalities. You're here, so you already know Dr. Schama. I hope you caught his really superb and exceptional speech at the plenary yesterday, and also his very passionate presentation at the debate in the debate chamber yesterday. My name is Bobby Ghosh, Dr. Simon Schama. If you would like to give him an initial round of applause, please. Thank you. And Dr. Schama, I'll swing straight in by picking up on the point that you made at the debate chamber yesterday when you were talking about populism and the rise of. Could you give us a little disquisition on what is it about this moment in the world that we see so many populists rising almost simultaneously? What is it about this moment that empowers them, allows them, or what is it about us, the populace of the world at large, that makes us sort of moths to their flame?
Yeah, powerful and deep and crucial questions. Populism, Bobby and I were just talking about its rather narrow origins as a term. And I promise, nobody should panic. I'm not going to give a long historical lecture, but it was a very specific American political movement in the late 19th century that arose in the hinterland, really, of American agriculture. And it was characterized by a sort of terror and hatred of great metropolitan cities, of high finance, of bankers, all of which were really, to those who were actually losing out in the industrialization of agriculture, big business agriculture, was already a kind of bad sign. So there was a sense in that American world of the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s that the true America, the America of the homestead and the unlimited prairie, was being robbed of its democratic rights, if you like, and of basic welfare by distant people. And that, of course, was a period of enormous economic structural change, of cartelized industries, the heyday of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Jay Gould and so on. And what we're living through now, I think, Bobby, is we talk about it because that's the buzzword, as the fourth industrial revolution. We're living in a comparable period because of globalization, and also I think because of actually the digitization, really, of pretty much everything, where people simultaneously feel connected and lost, and really lost. And also there's the sense actually in not just, if you think about Hungary and Poland and the small town world, really, there's a sense very much of some narrow metropolitan multiracial elites, the terror of the city as a place of racial melting pot, was very, very strong. There was always a bit of an anti-Semitic feeling to it and anti-black feeling to it in the 1880s and 90s. That's not gone away. So in a weird way, this ostensibly rather narrow movement, which had its second wind in Huey Long in Louisiana, in Father Coughlin, and which began in the 1920s and 30s to use a new medium, namely radio, to stir up fear and hatred. All those things actually have had, I call it kind of zombie politics in a way. They've kind of risen from the tomb, determined to eat new flesh. And I guess the surprise was that so much in modern life, not just American life, the assumptions about needing education to understand the world and to make informed political decisions themselves turned out to be a liability when you had a kind of showman genius, and there is a kind of reptile-like genius to what Donald Trump did, in taking the language of reality show and making it the language of politics. What that all did was to avoid homework. populist politics is all about gut instinct, as I said in the speech yesterday. It's all about knowing a different kind of knowledge. You know, you don't have to know the complications of the world. You know in your gut that you want to be with people who look and sound and cook and worship like you. And that's all you need to know. And everything else is what the New York Times, what is now stigmatized brilliantly as the fake media tries to sell you. So that's, you know, it turns out that there's a century difference, but what we all thought was really a footnote to history has moved right to the center. And it's shocking, but illuminating, really.
But the appeal seems to be not only to people who are in the sort of highly digitized society, but it seems to be across the board. So you, in rural India, where the digital world is still some distance away, in hyper-digital Japan,
Right.
in Rwanda with Kagame, the populists are appealing not only to those who are sort of digitally marooned, but to those who are not even swimming in those waters yet.
No, well, I think, I mean, you know, who in the world, even in very challenged economics and educational circumstances, does not have a phone? May not be a particularly smartphone. I remember going a long time ago now, 7 or 8 years ago, into the heart of a really ferocious slum in Freetown in Sierra Leone, Crook Bay, which is one of the most extraordinary places I've been to. And still there were, you know, the only light more or less offered that was not supplied by a dim light, courtesy of Chinese infrastructure, were the lights from people's phones. So when you have that, you can still hook up to what's being said by a populist demagogue. No, I mean, the extra piece of the puzzle is really the ability of authoritarian leaders to realize that votes can be orchestrated and actually delivered without debate. In other words, debateless votes. I mean, that was something Alexis de Tocqueville picked up on, Alexander Herzen, two great but self-consciously defensive defenders of liberal democracy, liberal constitutionalism in the middle of the 19th century, sorry for all the history, when they were talking about Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon, a lot less dangerous, I think, than the likes of Donald Trump or even maybe Viktor Orban. You know, he had the genius of seeing that through his name alone in 19th century France, he could simply appeal to a kind of instinctive nostalgia for Napoleonic glory, even though he's a very different person, and that he could work, it was really a kind of plebiscitary regime. He could rely by actually pumping up national feverishness on votes being delivered. And that's the other dark insight, is that a lot of people do not want to be bothered with constitutional niceties. They actually like someone to actually take the decisions for them. That's Duterte, for example, you know, is a massive example of someone who has seized on that. And the kind of strong mannery that we thought we got rid of with Hitler and Mussolini and the rest of them turns out to have a much longer life in ostensibly democratic societies. So Viktor Orban's, on the face of it, oxymoron of illiberal democracy turns out to be something very real.
As we speak, there's something that approaches an election that is taking place in Russia. The populist.
Gee, what a cliffhanger!
Yes,
what
exactly.
A cliffhanger.
Right? Who could tell whether he'll win by 99% or 98%?
Yeah.
He is the populist's populist. He's the godfather of so many of these. I mean, there are dotted lines and straight lines from so many of these other populists to Vladimir. If you like, as a historical.
Everest Tsar, Russia didn't. One doesn't automatically even sinkhole. It was integration. You know, young. So there was never any chance. good index, isn't it? Yeah, index of actually whether you're going to have a free society. By show trials. Once he and people like him and the regime discovered that a vast majority of people didn't really care how many television channels were available to them or how many news agencies, then he was free to do his Tsarist thing, essentially.
And do you feel, as so many now do in other parts of the world, that he is deliberately set out to proliferate this?
No, I think he's quite surprised by it.
Yeah.
I don't know why I feel that. No, I mean, of the many strategies which Putin, now, of course, actually it looks like he's hacking everywhere. Yeah. So one might say, well, the best thing, I think he is very, very clever. He's not like Donald Trump. So, of course, the systematic penetration of the American electoral system last year, and I'm sure this year too, in 2018, he's able to see that what populist politics delivers is a kind of febrile exhilaration, but crap government. Actually. So that's perfect for Russian interests, really. What would you like? What could be in your wildest dreams better for you than Steve Bannon, who wants to liquidate every department of government, including the State Department? It's perfect for Soviet interests. Means that Soviets can pull Freudian slip, meant the Russians can pull above their weight in the Middle East and so on. So I don't think there was any finely calculated plot. But it also helps, of course, again, in ways I think he probably, I don't quite give him that much credit, couldn't have anticipated in Poland, for example, that it would produce in, what is it called, Peace and Justice or Law and Order Party, anyway, it would produce a relatively friendly regime, and that without actually needing to reformalize the Soviet Empire, he'd be able to actually depend on governments in Eastern Europe, which were certainly not hostile. The key problem for him is the Baltics, where, that so far not surrendering to populist nationalism.
So now, where does the fight back begin? In the U.S., where you and I live now, there's a lot of bandying about fairly loosely of the term resistance, without really giving it any shape or form.
Right.
Where does the fight back begin? Are you seeing green shoots of something that gives you hope?
Yes. I mean, I vote in London, actually. I still have a solitary British passport, ridiculous. I have the oldest green card in the world, 40-year-old green card. But most of my life is spent, I pay my taxes in the United States. Most of my life is spent in America, so I'm very committed to that. And I'm actually more optimistic about America, maybe naively, than I am in Britain. About Brexit. And the reason is simply that the Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, provided for elections every 2 years, not every 4 years. And normally, one brush those aside. The midterm elections characteristically always deliver contrary votes to the administration in power, but they also deliver extraordinarily weak turnouts, as Barack Obama found twice. It's fatal to be too cheerful about it, superstitious about this, but the signs of turnout, not just in extraordinary elections like the election to fill a Senate seat in Alabama and the election we had in western Pennsylvania, a hardcore Trump voting area of Pennsylvania, but also in state elections, which really nobody pays much attention to usually, in North Carolina and Virginia and places that I have seen absolutely record mobilization of turnout for the Democrats, almost no thanks to the Democratic Party machine. Yeah. That's a little unfair, because I think there are tremendously juiced up younger workers who are knocking on doors and really do an extraordinary ground job in those areas. And it has to be said again that most, as far as the elections to the House of Representatives go, the Democrats need 24 seats to flip control, which is a very, very big deal. For a start, it's the House of Representatives that proposes articles of impeachment. And there are a lot of Republican House of Representative congressmen and congresswomen seats in essentially Democratic states. There are 4 for the picking for a start in California, mostly in Southern California. And many of the other elections, which really, if the Democrats can't win, they don't deserve to be in business as a party, are in suburbs, in the western suburbs of Chicago, in the suburbs of Denver, in the area around Orange County in Southern California, in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, some of which were in play in that extraordinary election last week. So those are better educated. Women's votes are much more mobilized even before the Me Too movement. The kids we saw so wonderfully yesterday, many of them will be voting. When they're not voting, they're determined to get out the vote. So the whole quality of what a midterm election is has really been transformed in America in ways, I think, that's not particularly happened elsewhere, where, you know, as it were, constitutional representative democracy is embattled with populism.
So I'll ask one more question, and then I encourage you to get ready with yours. And are there mics going around? Okay, there'll be mics going around. Just put your hand up and try to grab my attention or the attention of someone taking the mic around. Since we're talking to an audience of teachers, can I ask you if the rise in populism in some way represents a failure in the modern education system, and if there is a corrective that can and should be applied?
The lady nodding her head there.
And is there a corrective that you would prescribe that should be applied to the way we teach our kids?
Well, this is going to be a very sentimental answer, but I do think it's important, has not been addressed. One of the things which, again, particularly in America, but I think it's true in Britain as well, it's true in France with Marine Le Pen. I mean, one astonishing phenomenon, in case somebody hasn't noticed, is that Jean-Marie Le Pen, you know, the old Nazi, basically, certainly Vichyite fascist, his memoirs have just become a runaway bestseller, memoirs which no orthodox French publisher would actually touch, instantly became a bestseller. That gives you the sense that there is something sexy about hatred. It's really upsetting, which you know, conventionally
the word you used yesterday was gleeful.
I did, yes, gleeful. There is something viscerally exhilarating. A lot of those of us who have been trolled, you know, the famous Pepe the Frog meme that you know, Bobby, in America, essentially it's all about abuse. You know, the kind of images of Hillary Clinton hanging from a gallows. It's really about the kind of onrush of abuse. So it specializes in negative things. And the kind of high-mindedness of liberalism, of constitutional Democrats, hasn't really caught up with that. It does seem a bit too academic. So it's not, it probably isn't a complete antidote for it. But there is something absolutely heroic about the history of liberal democracy. Generations died for it, whether you look at, you know, John Milton or Nelson Mandela. There is a story to be told about that, and it's not being told because it is actually taken for granted that somehow it's a kind of dull things that high-minded newspapers, you know, rest on. And sort of the kind of heroic history of the struggle for democracy isn't really being told properly, except in specific identity communities, like suffragettes and votes for women and civil rights. But as something that belongs to all of us, you know, that had to be fought for, that is not being taught to our children very much. Maybe wrong, maybe being taught I mean, Gandhi is a very good case in point. You know, the possibility of non-violent victory. Yeah. A mass politics invented in not violence is an extraordinarily heroic story. The trick there is to make it heroic without being sanctimonious. Yeah. Because sanctimoniousness will never win against the sexiness of wickedness. Not ever win, but it has a hard time. So it has to be a great story. It has to be a gripping story.
Okay, so we're going to now start the gentleman here. Could you identify yourself and since we are short on time, swing straight into your question.
Yeah, so my name is Jelmer Evers from the Netherlands. I'm a history teacher. And
from where, sorry?
From the Netherlands.
Oh, from the Netherlands.
Your speciality.
Waarom? Where exactly from the Netherlands?
Utrecht.
From where?
Utrecht.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm a bit worried that we're discussing symptoms of what's going on. because are we really delving into the political economy that's really leading up to Donald Trump? And that also has to be with our economic system, our capitalist system.
Very good point.
And I haven't heard that here in this weekend that much. And when I've reading, for example, Danny Roderick or Branko Milanovic or historians like Bas van Bavel, they're really delving into this dynamic way more than I think the general public knows. And I think we should be educating our children in that sense as well. So how do you see that sort of whole political economic system?
Well, I think if I understand your question rightly, and I thought I understood it better at the beginning than at the end, it's certainly true that the collapse of Marxist socialism, for example, as a viable system, not of social democracy, but of, collectivism, really, as a system it collapsed in Russia, it collapsed in China, left an enormous fertile place for nationalism and protectionism, as we saw last week, to move into for a much narrower view about economic self-interest. But the other half of it is really that the kind of presentation of the economic system, which managed to survive this horrific recession, worldwide recession, but with very unequal rewards given to different sectors of the population. It has a very bad kind of shop window. What it feels like is really simply, the caricature of faceless Brussels bureaucrats, the standard thing in Brexit propaganda, is a case in point. The whole of liberal capitalism just feels like shopping opportunities. It just feels like the management of the business cycle. And that's not something which younger generations really, I think, particularly tune up to. It has to be more than that. How do you, for example, honestly, they're the generation which is going to inherit our present world. How do you deal with a social world and an economic system in which a vast majority of jobs are going to be done by non-humans, by artificial intelligence and by robotic production lines? What are the kind of job opportunities? What are the kind of skills? They're not going to be even engineering skills. They're not going to be technological skills. Machines will design software for other machines. That is going to happen. Humans are not going to be driving trucks or cars. That sort of thing. It's a terrifying future, but it's also an opportunity for a proper discussion about the relationship between technology and social justice. And that's, except around very specific discussions of the minimum wage, guaranteed minimum wage, that sort of discussion is not being had. I'm not sure that's the answer. Is that the kind of answer? Yeah. Yeah, well, it is, but labor movements are, as conceived, only there to address short-term conflicts. They're very important short-term conflicts. My colleagues in England are on strike right now against an absolutely outrageous attempt to reduce their pensions, really, just an awful thing. But I'll just say one more thing, Bobby, so very, very quickly. What is one of the extraordinary triumphs in an awful way about populist politics, and it's egregiously so in the case of Donald Trump? His cabinet is packed with the hyper-rich. Yeah. People are actually using public money to, sort of like Stephen Mnuchin, the appalling Secretary of the Treasury, to fly not just on government planes, but on military planes. Tens of thousands of dollars for one trip, while Donald Trump manages successfully until now to present himself as the champion of the forgotten, as he likes to put it. That is grotesque. You feel Orwell absolutely spinning in his grave. And it needs strong, articulate, oppositional rhetoric, which is missing right now. It's missing right now in American politics in order to challenge that.
My name is Armin Doucet. I'm a world issues and modern history teacher in Canada.
You're my hero, then.
This is a dream panel for me, having Mr. Ghosh and Mr. Schama together. And I know, Yelmer, you're agreeing with me on this.
Where in Canada?
Moncton, New Brunswick, on the East Coast.
Oh, yeah, no. I lived in Nova Scotia for a little bit when I was doing research in Halifax.
In Halifax.
I was doing research for Rough Crossings that Bobby and I were talking about. So I know that part of the world very well.
Great. I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't do this for my student at the moment. She is pleading with me and did a research on you and was looking at you.
Tell her to get a life.
Yeah.
You know, for instance.
Well, she's looking at a passion project. She wants to look at the evolution of art during World War II, and she's pleading with me to ask if you would be willing to give her some insight or advice if she sent you an email.
Of course, of course. That's not what we really call a question, actually.
But
of course. She needs to go to, and because we're all friends here, I'm now delivering. If you can remember this, it's best to go through my assistant, actually, who's called Marta, like the Spanish version, no H, Marta E. Hamilton @gmail.com. And she should say, what's her name?
her name is Regan.
Okay, so she should say we've had this we've usurped Bobby's kind hospitality.
I apologize for putting you on the spot, but thank you.
You know, but educational.
Other questions? It's a lady back there.
Hi.
And then thereafter, a lady up here in the front.
Hello. Hi, my name's Tatiana, and I work in technology as a form of citizen engagement. I really enjoyed listening to you yesterday because you talked about Herodotus and Thucydides, and I'm always the only classicist in the room everywhere. And I live in Dubai, and I don't meet many others. I wanted to ask, I've had a strong belief for a long time, which may be naive, that emphasis on the humanities, despite the fact that we're focusing a lot on STEM skills and innovation for the future, that the humanities within education systems can create better empathy amongst young learners, which can be a source of conflict resolution in a populist world, and empathy as a way of developing better dialogue for ultimate kind of social cohesion. Is this totally naive, or is this something that as a historian...
Well, I mean, what's your first name? Sorry?
Tatiana.
Tatiana. No, well, you'll have gathered from what I was saying yesterday. I think it's practical, so far from being naive. I mean, one of the problems, again, which I didn't set out yesterday, but I go around ranting and raving about, is that, you know, essentially what European cities in particular, but not just European cities, are faced with is the kind of blowback from imperial experience. You know, the assumption at the end of the Second World War in Britain, for example, was that the British Empire, the Raj in India, had been so extraordinarily culturally, those who wanted to immigrate, the same of assumption happened to Empire was still unity, but living together within a shared body of learning. And you're not compromising it. The right-wing tabloid press will always say, oh, you're just sucking up to some form of politically correct multicultural. The issue is really how to think about civics, which is very important to teach. It's very demure. I mean, it's very lofty. It's like going to church, you know. Nothing wrong with going to church or temple or mosque or synagogue. But it's sort of, you need something more for the kids. You really, for young people, they need to be excited about what they're reading and what they're understanding, I think.
A last question here. I'm very conscious of, he has to catch a flight, David, so.
Hi, I'm Sarika. I'm a special educator in India. And I think a lot of what you said for the last question answered what I was going to ask you. Since we're talking about populism, and when we see such parties and individuals come to power, we also see them make changes and modify the curriculum for their own, to suit their own agenda. And sort of like, I mean, isn't it like you're building another generation that's fed not only by the media, but
difficult.
by and it becomes really difficult. So I was thinking, like, what can be a solution for this? Should we abolish, like, generalized textbooks? And, like, how can we teach history in a way which doesn't leave room for such manipulation? And,
I think we have to have a whole conference on this next year, but you're quite right. There are sad things. I mean, I watched the polarization of Hindu-Muslim politics, you know, with increasing dismay in India, but there are even worse things. I'm not really answering your question, but just to say it's a really important question, and it has to be worked out in textbooks and in teaching. But one of the saddest things, you know, happened in cities like Baghdad, where Sunni and Shia Muslims, you know, lived on the same street. There was absolutely no issue at all of them being enemies. And then actually they had to physically separate their neighborhoods, really. And I'm not even to begin to speak about the catastrophe that's befallen Syria. And it's very, very hard. I mean, a lot of the coming back together again depends on neighborliness. It's when it's what's happened with populist politics from India to America is a kind of, an artificially engineered estrangement between neighbors, really. And that's always been a terrible thing, the sudden dawning in the minds, usually of the majority population, that somehow those who are living among them are not just who they thought of as neighbors, are strangers and probably enemies, probably a fifth column. And that is, I know what to tell you, except actually that in our teaching and our writing, we have a duty to confound that, which is a kind of, feeble writer professor's way of doing it. But we'll have a conference on it. We'll have a much longer session next year, courtesy of Bobby, and talk about exactly that.
You do have to go. You have 1 minute left. I'm going to ask a very short question for the benefit of all of us. A book you're reading now or have recently read that you can recommend that helps us understand our world as it is today?
Yes, there is a most wonderful book. I think the best novel I've read in years and years and years by Mohsin Hamid, who I believe is Syrian but writes in English. It's called Oh, is he Pakistani? Okay, thank you. Well, that's a very important difference. I've never met him, so it's good not to know where he's from. But it's a book called Exit West. He wrote a very good novel called The Reluctant Terrorist. But this is much better. Have you read it? You're Tatiana. Yeah, it's a most extraordinary novel. It's not long. It's really about the fate of refugees in a country like Lebanon or Syria. But to describe it like that is to sell it short. It's a beautiful lyric. It's a love story, really, set in the middle of a terrible refugee crisis, and it would spoil it. Have you read it, Bobby? No, okay, well, it would be a real spoiler. Something very weird happens halfway through the book, which is it's a book of absolutely exquisite genius, and it really is about this issue of neighbors that become strangers and the sort of terrible feeling of no way out. It's the best book on that terrible dilemma, that either fiction or non-fiction. Exit West. And I don't know him. I'm not getting commission on sales. It's a wonderful book.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Simon Schama.